Hello and welcome back. This is going to be my usual end-of-month haul from the Book Thing of Baltimore, a wonderful nonprofit where they give out free books every weekend, and you can also drop off any unwanted books you have. Now, you may recall in the past couple of weeks I've been trying really hard to be restrained in how many books I get and really trying to save some space, and yeah, it kind of all went off the rails this week, I'm afraid. But let's see what I got. First, I got this collection of poems, Mr. Cogito, by, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, I'm not sure, Zbigniew Herbert. And I got this French book by Michel Serres, Omniscience, which is sort of a pun because l'homme is man and omniscience. And this appears to be a work about bioethics and sociology. Then I got this novel by Walker Percy, The Second Coming. I just read Walker Percy's The Moviegoer, and it was the first of his novels I'd read, and I absolutely loved it. It's one of the most depressing novels I ever read, but it was really, really good. Highly recommend it. And I've heard basically none of his other novels is as good, but I figured I might as well go for it, and I love the cover. Then I got Ascent of the Mountain, Flight of the Dove by Michael Novak. This is a theology book, and I read theology, philosophy, and I read one of his previous books called, what was it? The Experience of Nothingness, I believe. Nothingness was in the title, I think it was Experience of Nothingness. And I thought that was really interesting, so I'm looking forward to reading more of his work. And then I got Self-Portrait with Woman, which is by, here I go trying to pronounce these names again, Andrzej Sikorski, I believe is how you pronounce it. And this is a Polish novel that appears to have been pretty highly acclaimed. Then I got Sunset Song by Louis Grassic Gibbon. This is the first in a series called, let's see, A Scots Quair, and is supposedly a great classic of Scottish literature. Then a novel, Brothers in Arms by Michael Carson. This is one of these novels that Plume published in the late 80s, early 90s. Basically anything published by Plume, which has that little symbol up there, if I see it on the shelf and it was published late 80s or early 90s, I just grab it. They published just some great stuff back then. Then I got Femme d'Alger by Assia Jabbar, who's a pretty famous Algerian writer. And Le Degré Zéro de l'Écriture, suivi de Nouveau Essai Critique by Roland Barthes. Barthes is one of those big figures in literary criticism that if you run in certain circles and you want to sound sexy, you have to drop his name every once in a while. Then François de Champy by Georges Sand. I've read only one of Georges Sand's novels, La Petite Fadette, but I really enjoyed that one and have sort of been collecting her work ever since and need to get to reading it at some point. And Le Chevalier de la Charrette by Chrétien de Troyes, which is a medieval romance. He wrote several Arthurian and medieval romances, Eric et Enid, Yvain, L'Histoire de Graal, and I really mean to read these because I love Arthurian literature, I love medieval sagas, but they're written in Old French, which isn't super hard to read. It's sort of like reading Middle English is to reading English, but I kind of do need to psych myself up to read them, and have not yet. And then Contes et Propos by Raymond Queneau. Raymond Queneau wrote one of my all-time favorite books, Zazie dans le métro, which is just this crazy, naughty, surrealistic romp, and was also made into a pretty good film by Louis Malle, but you should definitely read the book first. And I've read a couple of his other books, and I just really like him. He just has this crazy sense of humor, very surreal. And then I got Double Vie by Pierre Assouline. It's a novel, and Assouline was one of the big figures in French culture, French sort of art, belles lettres, so might as well check out his novel. Then I got Borderliners by Peter Hoag, I hope it's pronounced. I'm having this no idea how they're pronounced marathon today. And he's most famous for writing the novel Smilla's Sense of Snow that the film was based on. And honestly, the film didn't do all that much for me, and I sort of have looked at the novel and not really been all that interested in it, but I am curious to try one of his novels just because he's a famous Danish writer. And so I picked this one up. I'm not really sure what it's about, but it's published by this Harville imprint that I just love. They have the little lion there, and they published a Bulgakov novel I read, and I don't know, I have some sort of affection for them. So I'll give this one a try. Then I got The Jaguar Hunter by Lucius Shepard. Lucius Shepard, I'm ashamed to say, is another one of these writers who, this is, I believe, the third book of his I've acquired. Have not read him yet, but his books just sound so interesting, and he has such a reputation as just being a really interesting writer that I just sort of snatch them up whenever I can. And then I got My Life by Lynn Heginian. This is a work of autobiography. I don't really know that much about Lynn Heginian. Basically, the reason I picked this up is because a couple years ago in college, I took a course on American autobiography from a great professor, Dr. Bergman, and he had a list of, one of our assignments was to write a paper on a particular American autobiography of our choosing, and he had a list of options we could choose from, or we could choose our own. One of these options was this book by Lynn Heginian, and I sort of have this aspiration to read all the books on his list, so I grabbed it. Then I got Dear Ann Landers, Our Intimate and Changing Dialogue with America's Best Loved Confidant by David I. Grossvogel. I have to admit, I am just a sucker for these advice columns. I read Ask Amy every day. I read, oh my gosh, what is her name? Okay, I'm blanking on the Washington Post woman all of a sudden. But yeah, if there's an advice column sitting around, I will read it. And before Ann Landers died, when she was in the paper, I used to read Ann Landers all the time. So I'm curious to read this piece of social history. Then I got Max Frisch's Sketchbook 1966 to 1971. Max Frisch is the author of I'm Not Stiller, which is one of my all-time favorite novels. Highly, highly recommended. His other novel I read, Man in the Holocene, I was not such a huge fan of. And he wrote an autobiographical work called Montauk, which honestly was most interesting to me because the previous owner clearly had some issues, and she did all these weird drawings in the margins, and the book itself didn't do all that much for me. But because I loved I'm Not Stiller so much, I am eager to read whatever else he writes. And then I got this, The Looming Tower, Al-Qaeda and the Road to 9/11 by Lawrence Wright. Supposedly this is just a really good book on the subject. And then I got perhaps what might seem like an odd choice. I got 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. And you may remember from the movie haul I just posted that I mentioned how I get really neurotic about not wanting to read any French books written in English. And actually I read this when I was a little kid. I read it in English. But I got this because it is in the Illustrated Junior Library series published by Grasset and Dunlap. And these are just such beautiful books that I basically collect them. And, you know, it was there, it was free, it's worth the space. It's a gorgeous book. And then I got Empire of the East by Fred Saberhagen. I admit where I really broke down this time was the science fiction section. It's usually pretty picked over, but they had all this interesting stuff. And I've heard of this author and figured I should give him a try. Then I got Epitaph on George Moore by Charles Morgan. George Moore wrote a couple of sort of minor classics, Esther Waters and Confessions of a Young Man, and this is his friend's recollections of him. And it just seems like one of those books that's kind of rare and that it might be hard to find again, so I decided to go for it. Then I got The Shadow of the Torturer by Gene Wolfe. which is the first in a pretty acclaimed series he did. I'm curious to check out. Got The Getaway by Jim Thompson, who is a great hard-boiled writer, who wrote The Killer Inside Me and The Grifters, which are two of my favorite hard-boiled novels. And then No Orchids for Miss Blandish by James Hadley Chase, which is a pretty famous crime novel. The American Fantasy Tradition. Jungle of Stars by Jack L. Chalker, another author I keep hearing about. Arthur by Stephen R. Lawhead. As I said, big into King Arthur, curious to try this revisionist version, and pretty famous author. The Adventures of the Stainless Steel Rat by Harry Harrison, another science fiction classic. The Moon is a Harsh Mistress by Robert Heinlein. I spent much of the past couple of weeks convincing actually two separate friends that they really did not need to finish reading Stranger in a Strange Land, which is honestly, in my opinion, or obviously in my opinion, one of the worst books I've ever read. But I've heard good things about Heinlein's other stuff, so I decided to give this a try. Then I got Avalon, The Return of King Arthur, another Stephen R. Lawhead book. The Honorary Consul by Graham Greene. I have a lot of his stuff I haven't read yet, but I've really liked the ones I have. Medieval Russia's Epics, Chronicles, and Tales. Wyland and Memoirs of Carwin the Biloquist by Charles Brockton Brown, famous American early Gothic novelist. Turtle Island, collection of poetry by Gary Snyder. The Gold Diggers and Other Stories by Robert Creeley. Prick Songs and Descants by Robert Coover, very interesting 1970s postmodern writer. And last but not least, you can't go wrong with Chekhov. I got Rothschild's Fiddle and Other Stories. And if you've made it this far, thanks for watching, and I hope you'll join me for my next video.